Hey everyone, in this video I want to answer the question, how do I do X as part of my template deployment? And it's not creating a resource, those I can do fantastically within a template. How do I do something at the data plane of a resource? How do I create a new Azure AD account? How do I modify whatever it is? And we're going to solve that with deployment scripts. So that's the goal for this video. So first, the idea here is that I have some deployment. I have a template. So I have my kind of regular template. And remember, the benefit of our template is it's idempotent. I can run that things as many times as I want because it's declarative. I'm saying this is what I want the state to be. Go and make it so. Now that could be an ARM JSON template, or it could be Bicep, which goes and handles the ARM behind the scenes. And obviously in this, I'm going to focus on Bicep because that's very much the direction things are going. Now, ordinarily when we run this goes against the Azure Resource Manager. So that's that kind of RESTful API. And so we have our great big Azure cloud. And normally we're just creating resources. Now, there are many different types of resource I could create, but we could say, for example, hey, I'm creating a virtual machine. And that's great. But now, what if I need to do something else? I want to perform that other action, be it on the data plane, maybe it's a database, maybe it's updating something else, it's creating something that's not an Azure resource. So the regular template is not the right thing. Now, if I was using DevOps, if I was using kind of CI/CD, I had a pipeline, and I could think about, hey, this pipeline is my continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous delivery. We have those kind of workers, those runners that can do things. Now, ordinarily, that might be, hey, I'm going to go and trigger this template. But it can do custom actions. So I could, via those workers, those runners, perform those custom actions to perform whatever I want to do. So that's great. That would be one solution. But what if I'm not? What if I'm just doing a template deployment? Well, if I was creating a virtual machine, there are extensions. There's kind of the run command that lets me perform something. There's also the custom script extension. The run command is kind of a simple do this, CSE is a more advanced. Then that would run whatever I'm doing within that virtual machine. But the goal of this is really to do something about that virtual machine, not really to use it to go and do other things. And what if I'm not deploying a virtual machine? Well, as you may have guessed, this is where deployment scripts are going to save the day. So I have this deployment script resource type. And I basically have a bunch of properties about it, and I can define the script that I actually want to execute. Now, this environment it's going to create can really be based around one of two things. This can be based around kind of my Azure PowerShell, or it can be based around Azure CLI. I'm going to tell it which one of those I'm actually going to base my script around. Now, if we look at the documentation, which is actually fantastic for this, it actually goes through some of the key scenarios why I actually might want to use this. We can see here, look, add users to a directory, perform data plane operations, look up and validate a license key, create self-signed certificate. There's a whole bunch of different things I can do here, but really the point of this is I can essentially do anything I want as part of this. That's really the whole goal. Now, how is this magically working? How can it just do anything behind the scenes? So what happens is when I actually specify this deployment scripts resource within my template, well, it's actually creating a deployment scripts resource in Azure. So it's actually creating that. And what then happens, the way it actually runs code, is it's going to create an Azure container instance. Remember, this is kind of my containers as a service. It's just going to create it, runs for whatever period of time, seconds it needs, and then it will get deleted. And it's also going to, by default, create a storage account. Now, I could specify an existing storage account. What it actually cares about is files. So it's going to create a file share under there, where it's actually going to use that for both the input of kind of the script I'm running and output data. And this file share will actually get mounted into that Azure Container Instance to actually do those executions. So what this means is when I use a deployment script, what I'm paying for is that Azure Container Instance and the storage account, i.e. the size of the file for the few seconds this thing is running, and that's it. So there is a cost, but it's going to be super, super small. So that's what it's actually going to do behind the scenes. So say, hey, I want to run this script. The script can be inline, or I can reference a URI. That has to be publicly accessible, but obviously that could be a shared access signature. So it could be something like in a blob storage account, for example. As long as it's got a shared access signature, so it's still secure, I could pass that. I can also reference kind of supporting scripts that it might use as part of the all-up thing. Now, when it actually creates these resources, if you think about it, the way this typically works is something runs that template creation. Now, this could be me as kind of a human being. So I have a service principal. It could be a pipeline is running it. Well, it would have a service principal. And so that service principal that is running the template, it's that same service principal that's actually used to essentially create the deployment scripts resource. Then the deployment scripts resource uses kind of an on behalf of flow. So it's using the credential that calls the scripts to then go and create the ACI instance and go and create the storage account. So I don't have to provide a separate identity or anything else. Whatever identity is provisioning the template is used to create the deployment scripts resources you would expect, but also the ACI and the storage account. In early versions of this, I had to use a managed identity, and that was used to create those. I don't need to do that anymore. If I'm trying to think, well, what's the minimum privileges I need to execute this? Basically, I have to be able to create an ACI and a storage account. So if you look at the documentation, we can actually scroll down and see it does show me minimum permissions required. So it's showing, hey, look, I need to be able to do things on storage accounts and container groups, and obviously then manage deployments. So again, these are the permissions I need to use deployment scripts. That's what this is for. This is not if I'm using some other identity to do other things later on. This is to use deployment scripts, the service principal that's actually calling the template, i.e. this person, because their credential is going to get used to create the ACI and the storage account, they need that minimum set of permissions. So that's all that really is. Now, I can also specify an identity. Because if we think about it for a second, this script that's going to get executed within this ACI, maybe I actually want it to be able to do things against other Azure resources. For example, maybe I want it to be able to perform some data plane operation against an Azure resource, so it needs an identity. And the script does not run as me. By default, it's really running with no service principal that has any rights in Azure. If I need it to, there's different options, but the simplest one will be, say, hey, I want to essentially use a user-assigned managed identity for this. So as part of my configuration, I would say, hey, use this user-assigned managed identity. So I can think about, hey, well, we have my Azure AD, and I have some user-assigned managed identity I have created. Remember, that's just a service principal. And then that user-assigned managed identity actually exists as a resource in a certain resource group in Azure that is essentially representing and managing that service principal. And I can say, hey, I want to use that with this deployment script. So then within my script, it can use that user assigned managed identity. So whatever permissions this has, the script will be able to use. And then if it was PowerShell, the first line in my script would be kind of that connect-az account-identity to just automatically use that identity. If it was CLI, it would be az logon --identity. So, and I'll show you this in a second. Now, once I have that identity, if I needed like other secrets, other permissions, well, remember, there's still things like Key Vault. There's still things like Key Vault with its kind of secrets, with its keys. I could give that user assigned managed identity permissions on that, and then go and grab it through regular PowerShell, through regular ACZLI. So I can absolutely do those things if I need other credentials, other pieces of information. I do want to point out this ACI today cannot integrate with a virtual network. So if I had like a VNet, regular ACI, I do now have the ability to kind of hook it into a VNet. That is not here for that today. So I cannot do that. Now I'm going to basically just walk through a demo to kind of show this. Now I'm using Bicep because again, kind of the direction things are going, more and more if we're going to create templates now, rather than using ARM JSON, I'm going to use Bicep. The other reason is the documentation, if you go and look at it, in all of their demos, they're actually using kind of JSON. So I thought it would be more fun. So if you're trying to get help, and with it, the documentation is phenomenal. It's got examples, it goes through every parameter. It has additional sample files, all kind of using the JSON. So I thought I'd have a bit of fun and I would actually use Bicep instead. It does show you both, hey, I'm using an inline script, and it talks about actually referencing a URI, using external scripts, adding supporting scripts, and all of that kind of goodness. So that's what we're going to do. I'd also point out what I'm doing in my template I'm going to show you is only calling deployment scripts. That wouldn't be normal. Normally in the script you have it creating other resources, and then maybe, hey, I need to do this action in my deployment scripts. And it is just a resource, which means let's say maybe I have an output. Maybe the script I'm running, I can actually set outputs which will then be available to be used by other resources within the script. And the nice thing about Bicep, it will automatically work out, hey, the depends on, perform that kind of sequencing. I can also pass arguments into the script. So let's actually walk through mine. I'll kind of show you what I'm doing as part of it. So this is my super simple deployment Bicep file. Now you'll notice at the start, I'm just essentially saying, hey, look, I'm using the location of the resource group I'm deploying to, and I'm just grabbing my subscription ID. Then what I'm going to use, I am going to use a managed identity because I wanted to kind of show you this in action. Now my managed identity is actually in a different resource group than the one I'm actually deploying to. It's in this RGSCUSA, and it's called MI Saviltech1. Now because it's in a different resource group, I'm actually going to use the Bicep feature that lets me reference existing objects, but the scope is different. So I have to say, hey, this resource I'm referencing is actually in it's this sub, it's the same sub, but it's a different resource group. And just to show you that super quickly, if I jump over, if I look at my managed identities, you can see I've got this MI Saviltech1, and you can see, yep, it's in that RGSCUSA. And what I've actually done is I've given it a data role. Now I've only given it a data role on this one storage account, this SASCUS Saviltech, but it has blob data reader. Now if we actually go and let's look at that storage account for a second, because this is what I'm going to kind of demo to prove it's using it. I have a container called images that has really these kind of 3 files in it. And what I'm going to do in my script is try and just do a blob list, just to prove it can access the data plane. I do have another storage account that I'm going to change it to later on, and that's going to be this storage account number 2 that also has an images container, but that managed identity has no rights to this, so this should fail. That would prove it's using that managed identity. So if we go back, so I've got managed identity. I'm just going to grab the current time, so we update kind of the tag that forces the script to run, and I can pass in a storage account name, and by default I'm just setting it to that first storage account. Now I need to grab the managed identity that I want to use for my deployment script. So I'm just using, hey, I'm creating a resource called managed ID. I'm telling it the type, so it's a managed identity user assigned. And I'm saying, hey, look, it's existing. And so I just reference the name of it. But because it's in a different resource group, I set the scope to my subscription ID and the resource group of the managed identity. So that's just setting up the managed identity I'm going to use. Now, my resource itself, well, as usual, look at that. I'm going to call it dscript, and it's of type Microsoft Resources Deployment Scripts, and there's kind of the API version. And then you can see, hey, look, there's a name. So I'm calling this script test. So that's the resource name it will create in Azure of type deployment scripts. My location is just location variable I created higher up, which is the same as the resource group. I'm creating it of kind Azure PowerShell. I'm telling it I want to use a managed identity, so it's that user assigned, and then I'm just referencing my ID of the managed ID resource. Remember, that's the one I create up here, which is just that reference to the existing identity. I'm telling it a version of Azure PowerShell I want, and then I'm doing inline. Now my script is super simple. I'm accepting one parameter, which is the storage account name, the one I'm going to try and look up. Then I do a connect AZ account dash identity. I use the managed identity, which is going to be that user assigned one. I'm then going to create a storage context using my current account for that storage account name. And then I'm just going to do, hey, I want to get a list of the actual blobs. So I'm doing a get AZ storage blob for the images, look at all of them. And then I'm converting the objects just to a string. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to store it, well, as this deployment script outputs as something called output. This will then let me reference this elsewhere in my template. So if it was doing something and I wanted that value out of the script, well, I can now reference that elsewhere. Then I'm going to pass in arguments. So I'm just adding a dash storage account name, because remember, that's the parameter I'm expecting in my script. And I'm passing it the storage account name value, which, remember, is actually something I'm passing into my template execution up here. Then I've just got cleanup preferences. So on success, remember there's different objects I have here. So I can think about, remember it's creating this Azure Container Instance and this storage account. So if the deployment script execution is successful, it's going to delete these straight away. Because remember, I kind of want to save money. I don't want these things just laying around. If there's a problem, I think it runs for an additional hour, so I have a chance to do things. But I can also set that in my script. So if it's not on success, it will kind of keep those. But I can set kind of other values on that. If we look, I could also say, hey, delete it on an expiration or always. Then we have a retention interval. So this by default, this is in the ISO 8601 format. So this means, hey, for a time of 4 hours. So that's the deployment script resource. And I'll show you that. But that time is related to this object, that deployment scripts object. Now I can also set the kind of that retention, so those can also be kept for the same time as the deployment scripts object. So that, if we look at the code, that's this cleanup preference. So if I set the cleanup preference to on expiration instead, then those will be kept for the same duration, i.e. the ACI and the storage account, as the deployment scripts. And I'm just forcing an update of a tag to ensure this script does run every single time. So essentially all this is going to do, very, very simply, is get a listing of a storage account. But it's a data plane operation, so it has to use that managed identity to actually have the permission. That's all this is doing. So let's just execute this. So if we jump over, I've got Bicep installed. If I execute, I can see I'm running 3.1. So I'm just going to do this deployment. So I'm running it to this RG SC USA is where I'm actually going to deploy that to, which actually is not where I want to deploy it to. So let's double check something for a second. If I look at all my resource groups, let's have a look. So I actually want to deploy it to an empty one. So if I look, I have an RG Bicep demo, and there is nothing in here. So what we'll actually do, I don't quite know why that's not in my code, I'm going to deploy it to that resource group, so it will make it easier to see exactly what it's doing. And remember, the reason I had to pass a resource group for the managed identity is because it's not, the managed identity does not live in this resource group. So let's just execute this. So we're going to run that deployment. That should be pretty quick. If I actually go and look at that Bicep demo, and I'll kind of refresh it periodically, just make sure the script's not erroring or something, I'll actually see 3 resources. So I'll see kind of a deployment scripts resource get created that will be kept for that 4 hours. And then I'll kind of see this fleeting ACI and the storage account. So there's the script, the deployment script resource. And then what I should see is the ACI and the actually storage account. Now while that's running, remember ACIs are not in every single region. So make sure you deploy to a region that actually has ACI. And you can always go and check. So if I look for Azure products by region, and I've selected container instances, you can go and see all of the different regions. I'm kind of focusing on US right now that support ACI. So we'll hit refresh again. And I should eventually see that get created. So it's still running. It's waking up. It's a little bit slow this morning. Oh, there we go. Okay, so it's created an ACI instance, and it's created a storage account. Now, what it's doing in that storage account, if I'm quick enough, is it's creating a file share, and in there, I'll see the input, which is my script, and then its kind of overlay script, and then I'll also see its output as kind of JSON files. So I'll actually see all of that. But this is going to get deleted pretty rapidly, and I'll just be left with my script test. Now my deployment script will actually show me, hey, the storage account it's using and the container instance it's using, kind of right here, a link to those. It will show me any logs, and it will also show me the output of the execution and the content and input. So you can actually see, hey, look, there's the script input that I gave it. There's the arguments. And once it's finished, oh, so you can actually see there's now some output. So if I go back to my execution, very soon I should actually see this. So that same output, there we go. So we can see, well, look, that executed. And I can see, yeah, it listed the output of that storage account. I can kind of see, hey, look, there was those 3 files. And then I had another one in the folder. So it's showing me all of the content. So there are all the blobs I actually had within there. So that worked. And what's really nice about this is if we go back and look, let's go back to my refresh. Notice the ACI and the storage account has gone already because I said on success, delete. This script test will get kept for 4 hours. But I can now go at any time and say, oh, look, there was the output, there was the content. I could kind of export the template out if I wanted to, and it's going to show me, hey, look, we have removed the storage account and the container instance. But you kind of saw how simple that was really. It's just running that script, it ran as that principle, and I'm good to go. Let's just prove it's running as that account by changing it to point to a different storage account, and we'll just kind of change that input parameter when I call the template. So if I jump back over, and this time notice I'm adding in a storage account name to this second storage account. So I'm saying, hey, 2. So that now into my template will get passed in as overriding the original value. Remember, I passed that as an argument to the script. So it's now going to try and look up that second storage account, which the managed identity has no permissions to. Now also, notice I was messing around, I changed it to this on expiration. I'm going to save this. So what that should do is we should now not see the ACI in the storage account get deleted straight away. It will be kept there so I can actually go and poke around, and then in 4 hours time when the deployment script gets deleted, well, then it will actually get removed. So let's run this again. This time we're passing in, that's how we'll do, making sure I did actually save. That now it's set to on expiration. And what we're expecting this time is really no output. And if we actually go and look at the log, what we should actually see it say is there's kind of a permissions issue. The actual output from the script execution, which we will see here as part of it. So that's kind of the outputs, content inputs. But in my overview, I should actually go and see there were problems. So if we go back, once again, it's going to now go and create a new storage account and a new ACI. Remember, if I wanted to, I could actually reference an existing storage account. If I do an existing storage account, it will still create a new file share and then delete the file share, but it won't delete the storage account. So I can do that. So let's kind of just keep an eye on this thing then. So we can see, hey, we'll refresh. Again, it is taking a little bit of time this morning. While it is doing that, just the reason it is outputting is at the end of my script, I say, hey, output the resource descript properties outputs output. Remember that output is this thing I'm setting here. I actually called it output. I can call it anything I want. And that also is what establishes kind of that dependency. So if I had other resources referencing that property, it would make sure the script runs first before it actually tried to use it. So I can see I've got a new container instance, a new storage account. It's going to execute. And this time we'll just kind of wait. We go into the deployment script. Oh, but actually notice already. So in the logs, notice it's failed. This request is not authorized to perform this operation because the managed identity does not have permission on the data plane for storage account 2. It only has storage account 1. So my output's going to be nothing. But once again, I can see, hey, yeah, look, the argument this time was storage account 2. And if I go and actually now look at the completion, there's nothing there. But because I did that on expiration, if we go back in the overview, notice the storage account container is still there. And if I refresh, they're still there. So it's now going to keep those for the 4 hours. So now I could poke around a bit more. And what we'll actually do is, if we looked at Azure Storage Explorer, for example, it's a little bit easier to look around things. So from here, we could actually go and look at those files that it actually created. My memory is not that good. E2F. So let's look for E2F. So that's that storage account. From there, I can see it create a file share. There's the scripts. So from within here, we can see there's the input. This user script PS1, that is my content that I sent to it. So this is just going to be very small. Yeah, let's open it up. Then we can see there's my little baby script. This deployment script is their wrapper. It does all that variable stuff I was using. It does all the clever stuff. And then, if I go up a level in the output, well, then we have kind of the execution results. And we have the script outputs. Those JSON files is then what the portal, so I can see a little download start. I can see all of that kind of data there. And likewise, from the Storage Explorer, I see the script outputs as well, exactly the same way. But that deployment script's resource that it created, so there we go, output is blank. But remember that deployment scripts resource itself, it gives me easy access to those things. So hey, look, there's the logs, there's the outputs, there's the content and the inputs. And so really, I mean, that's kind of the main elements of actually using it. Again, it doesn't have to create the storage account. It could be an existing one. If it's an existing one, it will just create a new file share. And then whatever that configuration is, it will either delete it on success. Whatever I've configured, it will follow that same pattern. But that is deployment scripts. I mean, really a phenomenally powerful way that I can do other things from my template that is not an Azure resource. So it is simple to use. You saw that. You don't have to use that managed identity, remember? That was because I wanted to do things on Azure. If I wasn't, I don't have to use that. But remember, if I need to have some kind of authentication to some other system, having the managed identity is a great way to then let that script go and talk to Key Vault, for example, to go and get different credentials or secrets to then go and talk to other systems. So I could combine those things together as an all-up solution. Again, the documentation is phenomenal. Go read it, go look at the samples, and I think you'll be in great shape. Hope this was useful. As always, if it was, please go ahead and like, subscribe, comment, and share. And until next time, take care.